Many of the technologies that we're talking about today literally can be, the reason why they become popularized and mainstream is thanks to your work leading the World Economic Forum, creating the Center for Fourth Center, or what is it called, the Center for Industrial Revolution. Yeah, in San Francisco, but literally you legitimize so many of these concepts that I have to say the industry has not done a good job of continuing on. But before Sheila Warren, crypto was seen as a dirty thing. Decentralization was
back to that.
Yeah, was seen as a weird thing, and for people working in these fringes. And also blockchain was seen as something also just dirty, and Bitcoin was not respected. But you came in and you just took your entire career's work in building these bridges between software and socialware layers. And you set up this entire thing at literally this institution at the World Economic Forum that sanctions what technology is real or not and becomes legitimate or not. And, the industry hasn't done a good job of taking care of that necessarily. But I'm curious, as you hear about Luke's comment about resource management, and we know that Norway has done a different way of managing their oil. They are not a victim of the intelligence, the resource curse. But I'm curious how this makes you think of your career now. Before I let you go, I just have to ask you a moment of reflection on how we're managing the commons of everything you've done,
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we had a tide for a period of time. We were I always saw my role, I think, as we talked about this a lot, is normalizing new technologies and making them less scary, making them accessible to people, getting folks to understand how they fit into existing streams, but also how they were creating new streams. And yeah, some of that's been stewarded in ways that I really love, and some of that has been stewarded in ways I find terrible, But I actually think that the commons question is a really interesting one. And so Eleanor Ostrom, who was cited her earlier,
David Dahl was citing Ellen Ostrom.
Yeah, for the value men. That's actually where I kind of landed some of my discussions I've done about micro-communities, right? And the idea that... Micro-communities, right? And so this idea of localized governance that's very hyper-local to small communities, and thinking about governance on a blockchain, for example, is not I talk about this as imagining scale differently. It's not that you're taking one model of governance or anything else and blowing that up and trying to extend it, everywhere. I think of it as a language translation issue. You do something in English, then you just translate it directly into some other language and assume it's going to be culturally relevant, which it never is. You actually have to think about scale in a very small micro way. And so when I think about commons and Eleanor Ostrom, part of what she pioneered was this idea that local communities are better. They're simply going to be better at stewarding resources because they understand the context that in a hyperlocal way, as opposed to trying to bring resource management techniques from other sectors or other countries or wherever it is that may or may not be relevant in a local way. And I think you're seeing this, by the way, in a lot of the activism that's happening around data centers that is very specific to communities. Right, so twice side, we're just going to...
And driving some of those resources actually back to the communities. That data centers are not just this terrible thing, but how do we manage data centers as cooperatives? How do we, use all the energy?
All of that, right?
Regenerative.
Yeah. The entire field of regenerative economics, of course, was derived from Eleanor's work. And so I think this idea that we have to get back to the basics and really look at grassroots orientations, hyperlocal communities for everything from stewardship of resources to actually instantiation of new technologies within communities is a really important frame. And what I love about, funding the commons in general and all of the work here is it is rooted in that concept that something doesn't have to be, a decacorn financially or have billions of users to be of value. It can be of extreme value if it's relevant to a smaller group.
So I'm going to move off the stage, but I want to make sure as you move into your keynote that you talk about, I think, what a big part of what make those communities so successful in Ellen Ostrom's, observations is that these communities understood the culture. They understood the dark matter that you can't touch that make communities, successful in the way they manage these local resources. So I'm hoping that you can, give us a rallying cry in this moment as we figure out how do we solve for the intelligence curse, but really looking at can culture be that actual role?
Okay, you could not have teed me up better. Why don't you slides? Because you get a better prompt. So, as I was writing BART here, I was kind of laughing because I knew we were going to talk about, AI a lot today. And, well, what can AI do and what can it not do? And how is it replacing people and not? And I have to say, first of all, I'm deeply curious to see what happens when the parade actually starts and we'll just see about hours. But also, drunk college students during 10 a.m. running work inclusivity, great. That is something. As a local community, a hyper-local community, I do not think AI can replicate. So there is hope. There is hope in the drunk college students among us, of which I, at one point in time was one, and wow, nostalgia. But yeah, I wanted to talk today just about how I see a lot of the challenges that we tend to talk about in silos as culture problems. They're not just tech problems, they're broader culture problems. And we could go on and on all day. There's a whole talk I could do about whether tech is downstream of culture or culture is downstream of technology. And it all depends on your perspective and what particular vector you're kind of inserting into the conversation. But for me, we have a gigantic culture problem right now that is a global problem. And that's the problem of accelerating dehumanization. And to me, we kind of locate that a lot in technology spheres within AI, the idea about workforce displacement or creativity, all these things. Grammarly, the Grammarly lawsuit's a great example of this. But I actually think you're seeing this in real life, in person-to-person interactions. I have, family and friends in Minneapolis. And so when I think about the acceleration of deportation without due process, that is a dehumanization problem. Fundamentally, that is possible because one group of people that are currently in power have decided that they have the ability to decide who doesn't belong based on, accent or language or appearance or vibes or whatever it is, and then act upon that. That is a dehumanizing approach and orientation to immigration, right? And in many, many sectors, and I located that in Minnesota for the obvious reasons that everyone in this room is probably familiar with, but all over the world, you are seeing dehumanization that is happening in policy sectors. It's happening in conversation that goes everywhere. And so even in ways that we don't perceive, we are being dehumanized. And so to me, this is, again, a culture problem, and it is something we have to really be talking about consistently. And it's something I think we need to be addressing in every sector that we're really in, because it can be solved. It can be addressed through governance, through technology changes, through thinking about layers and everything else. Let me give you other examples. Okay, surveillance tech. I think most of you, if you ran into me over the last month, I probably said to you, have you seen the Alex Karp, Andrew Ross Sorkin Deal Book Summit discussion? I happened to be in that room in New York. And it was scary. It was scarier than, even those of us who know about defense tech, who have friends in defense tech or friends in NatSec, when people are saying everything out loud, which is helpful from the standpoint of we know what we're dealing with. And it's validating from the standpoint of those of us who've been kind of saying these things for a long time, many who are more expert than I am on these things. But this is the moment, right? People are not afraid to own that privacy is gone. So I love that we talk about privacy preserving technologies. But there is a fundamental assumption that we had privacy in the technology to begin with, which in some cases was not really true, right? So we're kind of putting privacy back. We're retconning, privacy into the narrative, right? Because we know how important it is, and we know that surveillance is eroding it. But we've already had this slippery slope kind of thing happening for quite some time in technology, but again, also in culture. As we have slowly frog into boiling water, allowed for convenience or other purposes, our data, our location, our whatever it is, to be taken from us, right? In ways that you give permission once, you don't really think about it. And I don't mean this room, I mean the broader society. You wind up in kind of scary places. So in the agentic field, we talk a lot about agents as a solution to some of these problems. Okay, you could have an agent that had a privacy layer where you were basically putting a shield between you and the data collector or provider. We talk about GDPR as being very outdated, regulation, which of course it is, although at the time I would argue is trying to do a thing. But I think that's also too narrow of a frame. And the thing that I have been seeing, many of us, I think not just me, but I'm the one up here, so the thing I've been seeing coming for quite some time is this intersection, right? So I'm a crypto person more than anything else, still to this day, and working in crypto for a very long time, trying to explain it to people and what it is and what it isn't. And stable coins, I always thought, programmable money, right, digital currencies, is a huge unlock. And it's an unlock that can go any one of different ways. Already, we're seeing stable coins provide, remove friction in certain places, and remove friction in ways that allows access into financial systems and the global economy in ways that we weren't really seeing, right? So remittances is a great example. People talk about this, how it was too expensive to get money, home, whatever home might be. In some cases, correspondent banks had pulled out of banks of the world, so you couldn't actually even hop your money through, a million hops to get it into the country you wanted to go to. People were reverting to flying cash, home to their families. Now you can do that using stable coins, using whatever stable coin you prefer. You can do a direct wallet-to-wallet transfer, and that is massive. It's a huge unlock that we should celebrate. But programmable money can go different directions, right? So when you think about the ability to program money, how did that factor in the idea that agents can code for themselves? So if you suddenly have a global smart contract and you have an AI that can basically decide what the outcomes and metrics are that are best for whoever the parties are, you suddenly have this huge explosion, we'll see, of the transfer of value, right? That is determined by, it's deterministic by what agents decide is the right metric or the right outcome. I think we also have this idea, and I think the popular imagination of AI agents is like, well, I have an agent, and no one really thinks beyond that. And even if every single person has an agent, we tend to think, oh, okay, well, that's not that big of a deal because we're going to have like agent-to-agent interactions, and it's just taking me out of the equation. So I don't have to do all the nonsense I don't want to do. Like, agent will do it for me. But you're probably going to have an agent that is customized to a variety of different things, right? Everybody will have a bunch of different agents. And then every corporation is going to have multiple agents, and they're going to segment, right, by customer, by their TAM is going to be hyper segmented, right? You're going to have like a precise agent dealing with you from that company. So you have to kind of imagine a world in which it's like this infinity stream of agents that are like at every stage, like something is being sliced or diced or extracted or exploited or whatever it is. And that to me is the dystopian world that gets really complicated. And then when you imagine that at every stage of that, I don't mean to be like alarmist, but when you imagine at every stage of that, the agent has the ability to code for itself a smart contract that then locks you into a pattern of behavior. I don't know that that is necessarily awesome. I don't feel great about it. I feel concerned about it, to say the least, right? Now, there are moments in history where we've had this kind of, explosion of opportunity. We tend to call them revolutions, industrial revolution. Tricia was alluding to the C4IR, which was something the World Economic Forum stood up in San Francisco for about, a period of, I think it was about 8 years it existed. I was there for 5 of those years. And the idea there was that these technologies would all intersect. Okay, and so this concept of intersectional technology is something I pull from critical race theory. It's the idea that you can't look at technology in a silo. So the intersection, like I just talked about, between AI agents, for example, and a blockchain or a digital currency like a stable coin or programmable smart contracts, that intersection, these are all going to wind up being horizontals. And we still talk about them and fund them, for the most part, like they're verticals, right? But they're all horizontals. Everyone's going to have an AI layer. Everyone's going to have a programmable money layer, or programmable value layer. Everyone's going to have these different layers in everything that they do that are interacting. And what I think is really great about that is that we also talk a lot in our industry about the privacy layer we're going to put in, right? Differential privacy. What has to be private, when, and to whom? The thing we don't talk about as much that I started really noodling on, which I haven't written about yet, but when I get time, is differential friction, right? And so one of the early promises of Bitcoin and of crypto was that we were going to remove all friction. And we talked about that like it was this great thing. And I've been skeptical about that, for a very long time. There's no question. I gave the remittances example on purpose because the removal of those frictions in low dollar payments in the remittance context from, a person who is working and sending money home is a good thing in my opinion. Okay. And so that friction, the friction of the bank fee or the transaction fee, is a good thing because it enables a better outcome for those individuals who are transacting in this low dollar way. And in some cases, the outcome is merely the ability to even make that transfer in the first place, right? That's good. But not all friction is bad, okay? Certainly anybody who's in NatSec would tell you, we like friction. Friction is great, right? Friction can be frustrating when the user has to everyone who's tried to pay anybody on Zelle more than $5 or whatever, it's incredibly irritating that every day you have to go in, it's annoying, right? But you can remove and divorce the inconvenience of a user experience without removing the friction that makes a system safer. And so I think we have to talk a lot about what kinds of friction do we want? So to go back to the legal context, okay, when I was in law school, I did some internships work with the Innocence Project. And back when I was in college and high school, I actually worked for CAP, which is the California Appellate Project. And, leaving aside political views on the death penalty, I felt that if the state of California is going to execute someone, they darn well better have a lot of process to make sure that is the right person. Okay, that is friction. I would say that is very good friction. It's a dramatic example of friction, but there are less dramatic examples of where friction is really critical to ensuring a system works the way it should. And so something I think we all owe it to ourselves in society to think about and talk about very, very consciously and actively and deliberately is friction. Where do we want friction? Because if we are focused on, if we don't think about it, and if we don't think of friction as governance, and we don't think of friction as a layer, right, that we are deliberately embedding into governance, into our tech stack, into our workflows, into our processes, friction is generally going to be gone. And I really, really worry about what will happen in that case. So I'll go back to that example, and the dystopian vision that I have in my mind is the frictionless ability of an AI agent that purports to be working for me, that is interpreting my desires incorrectly, not through malice, but just through accident or whatever it is, or because maybe I secretly don't know what I actually want, or what. We could make a million arguments about why it's innocuous. Nevertheless, it has the ability to codify in permanent code form something that then determines how I am operating in the world in my digital life. And that is interfacing with someone else's, and those small casual errors before you know it, like it's like the butterfly effect, right? You're like, oh my God, how do we get over here? And I find that very, very frightening. So in conclusion, I don't know where I am on time, what I would say is I am very convicted. I've done a lot of thinking and working in regenerative circles and other places just about what is the key to our collective liberation. Okay, and to get very dramatic about it. And it's collective action. There's no question about it. Okay, so I talked about this, and to my builders, I talk about this as the Voltron, approach, which just dates me a bit. But this idea that everyone's building a widget, put the widgets together, we get something better, right? The reality of competing with defense tech and surveillance tech with Larry Ellison, well, name check, the idea that we can compete with, anyone is going to be able to compete with that is not going to happen. So I will refrain from being more pointed than that. But collectively, we certainly have the opportunity and I think obligation to try to do that. And so I love events like this where we all come together, we hear what everyone's working on. And what I would like to do and what I'm hoping to do with this talk is just encourage this conversation part of your day. Think about what you're building, how it is removing or adding friction, what that friction might be doing or not doing that could be pro-social in a system, and how you might connect that into what somebody else is building so that together we can ensure that the right amount of checks are put into our system while there be people that are working opposite. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have actually a limited question for you. Is that, what is your current work now? What are you doing to actually turn actually productive friction, intentional friction? Because, like you said, some of that friction is going to be meaningful, but of course, the current structure that we have is useless. So we're introducing new stuff to this, but where do you see that media playing, or what's your work?
Yeah, so I know a number of boards, and a lot of what we're talking about in these spaces isn't that I guess some on board are regulator. I'm on a board of have looked at the startups, I'm in some of the bigger companies. This is a conversation I'm just injecting into everything. But Trisha actually had Baba review, because something I'm most excited about is I just share before that the DSGI Society Shusha runs. Which is work on something called predictive control, the control framework. Actually, I'd love for you to just introduce this concept to the room because I'm really excited about it. I do think it is one of the ways we can address this problem.
Do we hear that amazing, what is that? Not a banjo, bagpipes in the background.
It's starting.
Going to give us the choruses. I'm like, okay, we're going to jam out to proof and control. Well, so I think, one of the things you were talking about earlier when it comes to, I think it links back to what Luke was talking about, is that we have to introduce control pathways to the system. Because right now, when you have, referred earlier, is that if you have agents, if you want them to be useful, you cannot have them only on device. At times, they're going to need to lead, and they're going to need to go do stuff and lead your own cloud, lead your own, what mic is also hot. We're going to have to be in a multi-cloud, multi-vendor environment. And so what's fascinating is that what no one knows is that the technology for offering control is here. Luke alluded to that. Many of these technologies are in this building, and it's confusing because oftentimes these are called crypto or blockchain of centralization. But what we're calling them right now is just saying, look, there's a whole new category of technology emerging. It's called proof of control. And no one really knows about it because it has multiple names. So what proof of control offers you is something that we all need for this new world in HSC for orchestration. Is you need independence provability. You need cryptographic tamper-proof solutions. And eventually by 2029, they all have to be co-sponsored. And it means you not have this control. You cannot scale your agency infrastructure. And the 5 dimensions of that people are some of these you touched about, except on, which is privacy, your portability, verifiability, and your identity, and your security. And we actually just held about yours is at our conference where one of our members, First Person Project, the Linux Foundation, just figured out how to implement one of our members' technology, one of their solutions on First Person Project. Because one of the biggest threats to any open source project right now is what is a human? Who is a human? Who was an agent? How do you know who that agent represents? Where is that delegation, control? Where is who authorized it? Who's the identity behind it? Where is the proof of personhood or is it proof of relationships? And there are technologies that are called proof of control that are resolving this. And one of them is the First Person Project. And what the Linux Foundation did is that they are implementing First Person Project into the Linux kernel. And so I think that's why it's so important what you're talking about is that the technology is here, but we don't necessarily know about it because we're using different terminology for it. So I think it starts out hyper-locally in these buildings.
And I think we're also imagining that all of this is more competitive than collaborative, right? And that's just capitalism. I mean, it is what it is. But I think that what I loved about the Summit on Human Agency, which Trish is referencing, which happened 2 weeks ago or last week, is again, and things like this, is that it really is going to have to be about collaboration. So the collaboration between First Person Project, Advanced AI Society, Linux, this company called H2H, it's really about trying to experiment and put all these things together in one stack as one example of the way that this could work. But what I really love, to go back about proof of control, and the reason why I'm so excited to be working with you, Trisha, actually, and others on it, is that it's a framework. And it will eventually become a set of principles and standards and all of that is universally applicable, right? So it's a way of kind of doing, I think it's a way of kind of doing all of this that we're talking about that does ensure the preservation of whatever, or the injection, I would argue, preservation in some cases, like the ship has sailed, but the injection back to this idea that we need to be verified, right? In terms of what is happening, like who is doing what, where, when, and how. And if you can have that kind of accountability, if only you can have that visibility and transparency, can you create any accountability in a system? If you don't even know, who's doing whatever, it's impossible to actually create accountability. And that, I think, is going to wind up being, again, a big problem if we don't take an approach like this one.
Yeah, I really believe that we have the tools to figure this out. So I think if the world actually knew we have proof of control tech, AI wouldn't be as scary. It wouldn't be as doomsday, but it is right now. And so part of what we need to tell everyone, and part of the messaging, is that the greatest use case for crypto and blockchain is here. And that's securing the AI stack. It's securing the agentic orchestration stack. It's what many of you are working on, but we need to be able to have common terminology to be able to define it, just like the success of open source. What they did was they took free software and they said, it's not anti-capitalist, it's open source, and here's how we define it, here's how we make it commercially defensible, and here's how we make it legally viable. So with that, I want to thank Sheila Warren. We're going to move into a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and move from the morning, which is very much about an intellectual framing, to really a practice. You're going to hear from people who are implementing many of these technologies here. We have a speaker who flew in from Argentina. So you're going to hear, well, as a person who is maybe in a public, office position, or if you're working with a government, if you are trying to build out the socialware level, how do you start to integrate this? So definitely you have to come back from break in 7 minutes. See you soon.